Discussion will be very interesting. So much so that you're going to rush back to your seats, those at the back. Our next discussion will be about the role of stakeholders' engagement as part of companies' due diligence efforts. And we've heard this term throughout today so far, stakeholder engagement. How do we get everybody collaborating, whether it's in data or it's in due diligence and carbon accounting? Stakeholder engagement is key. I think you'll agree. And so for that, we're going to have another panel now, and I'm going to invite the panelists to the stage. So first of all, there's Hanna Helgesdotter, Global Relations and Human Rights Sustainability Manager from Systembolaget. Magnus Kjeldsen, International Secretary from Unionen, both coming all the way from Sweden. And to facilitate is my colleague Franzis Wimmer, Stakeholder Engagement Advisor from Amfori, and he's going to moderate. Francis, over to you.
Thank you so much, Raymond, and thank you everybody, and welcome to this second last panel. The beauty of the afternoon, everybody's tired, but I hope you still will find this interesting. Also, the title of this panel discussion, Stakeholder Engagement, Plunging into the Lion's Den, it kind of suggests that it's something scary, but I hope that this session today will convince you of the opposite. Before moving to the panel discussion, though, I would like to provide you with an overview of what we actually mean by meaningful stakeholder engagement in the course of due diligence, and also how Amfori facilitates that effort of companies. And after my presentation, we will then dive into the practical example, the collaboration between Systembolaget and Unionen. So, first of all, let me say, if you can move to the next slide, or am I navigating them myself? No, there you go. Let me say that really as Amfori, we consider stakeholder engagement an essential characteristic of due diligence. And that's pretty much along the same lines as the OECD due diligence guidelines state that meaningful stakeholder engagement is important throughout the due diligence process. I think today's discussion has also shown that really stakeholder engagement, collaboration was pretty much a common theme throughout every single session. And I'm glad that we have one dedicated session to this, so it's really good to see that this gets the importance that it deserves. Let me also say that Amfori BSCI Code of Conduct and our system are really in line with this and are fully aligned with the RBC guidelines of the OECD, and therefore also include a strong commitment to stakeholder engagement and collaboration. Now, if we move on to the next slide. So I would like to elaborate a bit on each step of the due diligence journey and what stakeholder engagement means along this journey. But before I do that, let me just very quickly reiterate also that as Amfori, we see this as a core characteristic of our system. In fact, you could say that our whole value or our whole system is built on stakeholder engagement and collaboration. Now, when we move to the first step, so embedding responsible business conduct into policies and management systems, what you need to do as a company is also to really have a strong commitment to meaningful stakeholder engagement in your code of conduct. The BSCI code of conduct in the system already include that. As a second step, identifying and assessing adverse impacts. Here, engaging with affected stakeholders or credible proxies such as NGOs or workers' organizations can help you to do that. Now, an example of this is our supply chain grievance mechanism, or also the workers' voice feature on our platform. When it comes to seizing, preventing, or mitigating adverse impacts, here it's incredibly important to also support your business partners and engage them, for instance, through building capacity, building training, and so on and so forth. And the Amfori Academy is a great example of that. Also, as a company, you need to pool leverage with other buyers, for example, through the Amfori Zero Tolerance Protocol. And finally, also, and very important, you need to engage rights holders or credible proxies during the development of prevention and mitigation measures. And a great example is the social dialogue series in Bangladesh that we rolled out last year, and Milad, who was very closely involved in this, our network representative from Bangladesh, also here to tell you more about that. Tracking implementation and results. Here, indeed, engaging with external experts to verify if the effectiveness of the measures is incredibly important. An example of this is also collaborating with the remediation partners that we work with as amfori, but also communicating your impacts and making sure that what you communicate is actually accessible to the impacted stakeholders is another key step. And here, again, the supply chain grievance mechanism and the reporting section on our website is a feature to take into account. And finally, providing or cooperating in remediation when appropriate. This is, of course, something where we try to also collaborate beyond our own association with other organizations such as Fairware and the German PSD. We've recently signed a collaboration protocol, and Charlene in the room as well can be very proud of that. Now, finally, let me just say that it's not an exhaustive list. So this is not really all the things that you need to take into account with stakeholder engagement, but I try to break it down to the essence for each of the due diligence steps. And with this in mind, I would like to move on to a video to also give you a brief glimpse of the collaboration that we will be discussing further in the panel afterwards. Thank you very much. No sound, then I sneak by.
Us not to lose hope, because once we lose hope, we cannot achieve anything.
In some parts of South Africa, there are challenges for farm workers and for those who want to improve their working conditions. Widespread alcoholism and poor living conditions, farm owners who don't want to engage with the unions, guard dogs and CCTV surveillance make visiting the farms and meeting workers difficult. Systembolaget is one of the world's largest buyers of alcoholic beverages and has the opportunity to drive change in the wine industry. But to do that, we need to know what needs to be changed. In 2017, Union's local branch, SPF, had an idea. We will work together. The contacts and credibility of SPF, Unionen and IUF opened the doors for Systembolaget to enter into a completely new dialogue with local trade unions in South Africa. The Memorandum of Understanding was born. South Africa became a test country, and now the cooperation is starting to bear fruit.
This work is so important because it creates a platform for social dialogue between the workers and the producers. And it also gives a possibility to work practically together.
It's a strategic tool that we can utilize both in organizing this unorganized industry and also building our internal capacity.
Local trade unions, farm owners and producers receive support in how they can engage in better and more productive discussions with each other. A reporting tool has been developed that makes it easier for farm workers to sound the alarm about deficiencies. A specific process ensures that the report contains enough information for the incident to be investigated and for Systembolaget to be able to work on a solution together with the producer and the trade union.
The reporting system, it's one of the biggest issues we struggle with in the agriculture sector. There's no way where we can report really issues that we struggle with. And I think the memorandum and the reporting system will assist us.
Systembolaget has access to the farms. And if we work together with Systembolaget, we are able to get onto the farms, talk to workers, talk to the farmers, to say, look, can we work together to improve the conditions? That's a good strategy. And the MOU is there. It's a tool. We must use it to organize more workers.
By working together, we have started a positive change in South Africa.
Much, and I think it already gives a good overview of what this collaboration is about, and maybe, yes, indeed, microphone. Let me. All right, good. So let's dive straight in. I hope you could hear my previous sentence, but Hanna, if I could start with you, and we already saw what this collaboration is about, but maybe you can elaborate a bit more broadly how you engage stakeholders in your due diligence efforts.
Yeah, sure.
And I think, as was mentioned in the movie already, we are one of the biggest buyers of alcoholic beverages in the world. That means that we source from roughly 100 countries. But at the same time, we are also quite weak in the sense that we don't have any local offices in any of those countries that we source from. So that means that we really need to have eyes and ears on the ground, and that is something that this type of collaboration, working with unions, NGOs, locally, really provides that type of insight. So without that, we will be more or less looking at risk assessments, different type of paper risk assessments, I would say. So this is really a way for us to not only identify risks, but also to start addressing them together with those that are affected.
Thanks so much. Maybe Magnus, if I can turn to you and also give a bit of background, like what initiated this collaboration actually?
Thank you. So Unionen is the largest trade union in Sweden with 700,000 members. We are very well connected also with trade unions all around the world. That's important to say firstly. Well, we have heard for many years about bad conditions in the wine industry. We have gotten reports of bad conditions on violation of labor rights and human rights. But the actual spark was 2016 and a Norwegian documentary called Bitter Grape. And that led us to take contact with the Systembolaget. We do take contact with our Swedish multinational companies when we are worried and have concerns. Sometimes we get a good and creative response, like we did from Systembolaget at this time, but not always. But we was very happy with this response, so credit for Systembolaget, I must say, to be open and creative in addressing this problem and trying to create something together. So out of something bad, something good was born.
Maybe Hanna, if I can get back to you also to just understand a bit this collaboration a bit better from your perspective. What, how does it work in practice?
What is it that we actually do, you mean? Yeah, got it. So there was a slight overview of the process in the movie, but in short, what this reporting channel is, that is really 5 steps. The number 1 is that the local union writes a report on whatever issue that they had on the ground with the producer or the farm owner. And then that report is sent to IUF staff in South Africa in this case. Then that checks, and I think this is a very crucial part for many of my company members here, then they actually check that there is enough information for the company to be able to act. I think many of us, and I see some nodding heads already, many of us know, so we received reports with, well, they weren't wearing PPEs. I passed this farm. Okay, for us as a company, it's very hard to act on that. So IUF checks that there's information on what was it that happened, when happened, where, are there potentially pictures. But also, and I think this is a very key thing, is that they also check that the workers have been informed about the report and that the union have tried to have a discussion with management. So we're not trying to bypass the system that is already in place with having a union on site. We're just trying to strengthen it. So after that, IUF, in short, IUF and Unionen checks the report, and then it comes to us. And by using our commercial leverage, really, which it is, we then talk to our Swedish importers and their producers and farm owners, the supply chain, more or less, and really then try to, what is it that has happened and what kind of remedial actions should we now take? And all that happens in collaboration with the local union. So they are involved throughout the whole process, which allows us not only to receive the information, but also ensure that whatever remedial actions we're taking are actually effective. And I think, again, that's something that many of us know is really hard to do in practice. So that's the idea.
You already allude to it. It's really hard to do. So what did you actually do in the beginning to make it work, this process?
I think there are 2 parts of this. I mean, it's very clear already that the unions have a crucial side in this. But it's one thing to have an MOU, and it's one thing to have this process. But how do you make sure that we're talking unions? We're not talking the presidents of unions. We're talking local representatives at producer sites to use this tool. So we, together with IUF and the union, we had numerous capacity buildings for the unions on how to use the channel, how the setup is, which of course is very important. But I think the second part that was actually the unions that reminded us about was, you can't just talk to us about this. You also need to talk to the producers. You need to let them know that this is happening, because otherwise you're losing all transparency and all trust that you have as a company with them. So thanks to the local unions in South Africa, we then also invited all the producers together with the union and IUF to talk about this work. And I think that was extremely important that happened very early on.
Now, in the end of the day, it's about workers. It's about workers having their rights respected or access to their rights. So how many producers and farms and through this workers do you actually reach through this collaboration?
So we map our supply chains, and in South Africa we have roughly 200 entities. That means both wineries and farmers and growers. Amongst those, we're then seeing that we have roughly 9,000 permanent employees and another 8,000 temporary ones. However, coming back to the discussion we just had on data, we probably need to take that number and make it a lot bigger. but that's the rough number as of now. And just to speak on that very quickly as well, what that means, that in South Africa, there's only 5% of the workers that are actually unionized, which makes this MOU even more important, because what the unions are often trying to do is to get access to unionize, and they don't get that access. And what this MOU allows them to do is, if you are not getting that access, that is also a report that you can file that we can act on. So even though it's just our supply chain, but technically it covers a lot more than that.
Thanks. Magnus, if I can turn back to you. Just to also better understand how this collaboration actually benefits or has benefited workers, like how many grievances have you received, how many have been remediated, you know, just a general take on how successful it's been so far.
Thank you. I think you need to be somewhat humble when it comes to addressing a big industry like this. The South African wine industry is big, and the agreement itself, it's about the global wine industry. So it's a big scope. However, in training, we have so far trained several hundreds of farm workers in human rights and in the way of reporting. And that is, of course, a very important step. We have also provided female farm workers a specific material on sexual harassment, how to handle issues like that. So we have, like Hanna said, built this very much brick by brick. It has taken time, but we have also engaged with all the stakeholders, including certifications, producers, other NGOs, you know, everyone, actually. We are working on this channel. We have gotten in a few reports in the formal channel, even more reports outside the formal channel by being present. So we have gotten a lot of reports. But I can say, due to the reports that has been put into the channel, we have got some really, really important reports that had made a huge difference already. And it's a kind of a curious, interesting details, actually, that speaking about the documentary Bitter Grapes in the beginning, some of the main character from the documentary Bitter Grapes has actually been through this kind of process together with us and Systembolaget. So that has been a really interesting journey. But we have many reports coming in already in the system. But like Hanna is saying, some reports shouldn't go through the channel as well. Some reports should be handled perhaps legally by the South African legal system, and some reports should travel all the way to Systembolaget. So this channel is also about creating and sorting and making things go in the right channel.
Maybe if I can just straight follow up with you on the challenges that you've actually faced in making this collaboration successful. So what you know, really thinking from submission or collecting grievances all the way to remediating them. What were the key challenges that you faced?
There are very many challenges. I have mentioned training to get out knowledge, to spread the word about this channel, how to report. We are also very aware of that many workers are afraid to report violations. I mean, there is a huge risk for them in losing their job, for example, in doing a report on a violation. So that is also one of the reasons why we have created a channel where the trade unions is following all the way, trying to make it as safe as possible for the workers to report violations against human rights. Then the South African, if we talk about South Africa, of course, has its history, its contexts, its widespread social issues, widespread, as you've seen on the film also, alcohol abuse, and so on. So it's a multiple challenge situation. And for the industry, I think the biggest challenge is to see the win in behaving sustainable, actually. To see that this fine bottle of wine is not made just by a great winemaker. It's made by a lot of people working together that needs dignity and respect also. So that is the challenge for the industry. For the unions, we also have challenges, of course. As like Hanna said, they are weak. They have now this tool that is a powerful tool if they use it. And we are really working on it. And yeah, it's a tough situation. But given the timeline, I think we have done really well so far.
Maybe also we can hear your side to this. So what do you feel are the main challenges from your perspective?
I think probably as we went along in this process, I think one of the key challenges that we are still facing actually is the matter of, we've been talking a lot about transparency, but when we're talking real transparency, are we ready to share our supply chains with the unions so that they are not only sending in reports blindly, but that they can actually specifically look at the ones that we are sourcing from? And I mean, this is difficult for many reasons. Because often the data is very highly sensitive. You're not allowed to share that freely. We are in very good dialogue with our Swedish importers and their producers on this, but this is a working project. And then I think the other side of this is, even if we could share the data, there's another aspect, and that is that this data changes. When we're talking about wine and grapes for wine, there are a new harvest every year. They're not always the same farms. So even when they would get that information, is it still relevant? So just again, to be mindful of how do we do that in a good way. So I would say that that's probably one of the things that would make this collaboration even more efficient. But that's a challenge to get to, something that we are still working on. I think the unions raised that issue with us when we started this work in 2017. So we're still not there.
Maybe also in the light of trying to increase impact, what would you say is needed to really scale such an approach? Like, what do you need?
And on that note, I would like to mention that, now it's Magnus and I sitting here, but we have also been joined by our Finnish colleagues, the monopoly Alko in Finland, and their union counterparts, PAM. So they have signed the exact same MOU and working together with the exact same process. So that's really, really good. So clearly it is possible to scale. What is behind that? And I would say there are two things. For us, it was extremely helpful that we shared the same code of conduct with amfori. That made it, the baseline was the same for both companies, and technically also then for Union and PAM and all the unions to hold us accountable to. And I think secondly, it was also important that Systembolaget and Alko in this sense had the legality to actually be able to act. So whenever the unions bring something to your table, you need to be committed as a company and be able to act on that. Not only have the conversation, you actually need to be able to enforce change. And the fact that Systembolaget and Alko coming in as the new ones in this work had that. It really, really helped to scale. And I think that's crucial for anything like this.
Magnus, anything to add?
Yeah, just to compliment Hanna, there is a lot of things to say about this, but I think to scale it, of course, I mean, business needs to respect the freedom of association and see that there is a need for collective bargaining. These rights are older than me. They are created back in 1948, 1949, and everyone has them as ILO conventions probably in their code of conduct, but the problem is they are not respected. There is no accessibility very often in the global work life to these rights, and often they're also worked against. So there is a mindset change here, I think, for the business to make these rights accessible to people, because otherwise we have no use of them. We have no use of a right that is not accessible to people. So that is one key point. I also think that it's to get this ground field level reports that we're working on, it is so crucial, and it also shows us a bit about there is a value in doing audits, of course, but we know that we don't get all the information we need from audits. So this is a way of complementing the audits to get the information from the farm level, or if you work in another industry, it might be from the factory level, because it is from that level we need the actual reports.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Hanna, if I can turn back to you, just also looking at what worked well, what didn't work well, what more broadly made this collaboration a success. What would you say are kind of the key factors for success here?
From a company side, yes. Yeah. I think there are so many things. We could talk all day, but I will mention a few things. And I think number one is leadership. It is so crucial that the leadership within the company recognizes that human rights is just as important as any other part of the business, and that is something that is a full commitment from the company side, because it does require new actions when you start doing things like this. You need to test new things, and sometimes that's a bit scary. So you need to have that leadership on board, I think is key. And then I think the other part which feeds into that is really to be transparent. Something that we made a key point of doing with Unionen and IUF was to be extremely transparent with what are our challenges, what are our risks that we're facing, what are the things that we currently can do, but maybe more importantly, what are the things that we cannot do? And this was important because we shouldn't create expectations that we couldn't live up to. And by being very clear, look, we can't do this, then we could together try to find creative solutions to that problem. So I think being brave in that sense and daring to say, I know that you want me to do X, but I can only do this. I think that was good for us. And I think finally holding each other accountable, I think has been extremely important. And I think for us from the company side, I mean, the unions have been working with the unions, but on the company side to really hold your supply chain accountable. If you have in your general terms and conditions that this is what you are required to do, then they need to do that. And it's your job as a buyer to make sure that they do, specifically in these situations, to leverage the playing field, so to say.
So maybe before we move to the Q&A, if I can ask you both one last question. What would you advise, based on your experience, our members, but also broadly the audience in the room, based on your learnings?
And, you know, based on this session, I would definitely say start engaging with unions. I know that it looks very different in many countries. I know that there are very different contexts, but even if it's just within, I think there are two levels. There's both on producer level, where there are unions, get them involved in the auditing process, in the remediation process. When you're doing producer visits, make sure that you also get to speak to them, see them. But then I think, you know, Magnus mentioned it, and I think it's such a good example. How we got started was really that we talked to, it was the union that was organizing at Systembolaget that raised this dialogue. And maybe that's more of a safe space. If you have a union that is organizing within your company, start talking to them, because chances are that they have a Magnus that works with international affairs at the big union. So start that conversation with them, and I think that allows you, what we've learned along the way, the hard way, I think, is that as any feedback is, and any consultation, right, it's only meaningful if you take that on board. And I think the feedback from the union is just as any other feedback, right, isn't really an opportunity to improve. And if you see it that way, it's not as scary, I think.
Any last words from your side, Magnus?
Yeah, I think, like Hanna said, be honest about the challenges that you have in your supply chain. Communicate your challenges. I know you're doing this in this forum, but also at the wider scale. Don't be too comfortable in some kind of monitoring from very far away, getting reports from some manager far away in the supply chains. Try to get as closely connected yourself sometimes to the workers. I think also realize the huge power imbalance that is in a supply chain. Realize that it's very difficult to raise a concern if you're employed by day, by month, or by week, with risk of losing your job. So I think actually to work proactive is also is working with making rights accessible, but also work with empower workers. Empower them to take part in the sustainability work and report.
Thank you so much. And I think we still have 10 minutes or so for questions and answers. I see Bernardo Cruza from El Corte Inglés, former board member of Amfori. Please, Bernardo.
It's on? Okay, thank you. Bernardo Cruza from El Corte Inglés. A very interesting panel, and it's not a question, it's rather explain our own experience in this field, because we started our collaboration with unions 10 years ago, and we finally signed a global framework agreement last year, 2021, with the two main Spanish unions, Comisiones Obreras and Unión General de Trabajadores. And it was fully supported by the board of directors. Otherwise, it would have not been signed, obviously. But most important is that what you said, and I fully support what you said, because I think we were able to prove over 10 years that we had built trust and credibility and working together. And the board of directors realized the value of such a collaboration, especially thinking on the main topic of this meeting, which is HRDD, right? So human rights due diligence. Because we know this is a very powerful and useful tool to have this enhanced due diligence. Because as you said, you know, doing and conducting audits is okay, but we all know it's sometimes not enough. And probably the uniqueness of the agreement that we signed with the unions is that first of all, it's global. It covers all product categories. We are a department store. In a department store, we have all kinds of product categories, from textiles, obviously food, toys, household goods, do-it-yourself, whatever you can imagine. So this is quite unique, and it was also a challenge for them, because both unions are part of Industrial Global Union, And as such, we reach out to all the countries where Industrial Global Union is present, but it was important to cover all other product categories, especially agri-food, because this agreement is also implemented in Spain, and there is a joint work done also in the country. So this, not a small detail, is that through this agreement, there was also the recognition of the amfori Code of Conduct as the base for our joint work. So I only can support what you said, and in a nutshell, this has been our own experience.
Thank you so much. Marius, our newly elected chair of the Membership Advisory Council.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, Marius from Migros, Swiss retailer, and it's a detailed question maybe to Magnus. We had occurrences in our supply chain where we also have a dialogue with unions and producers, and it is very politicized. The whole discussions, the unions, they are not really interested, in my point of view, of solving the issue. It's more about attracting, making some noise and get some attraction. And maybe also some new members to the union. So a very politicized context. And as a union in Sweden with a network, how can you, in such context, take influence in such situation? What would be your advice if you enter, or if you are in such a difficult situation?
This has been a question in South Africa. There are many trade unions within the agricultural sector in South Africa, and we have been working with all of them. And they also are, on a political scale, different from each other. I think, not knowing the case, of course, in detail, I would like to say that unions are different, of course. They have their own traditions, culture, and so on. But try to find a common ground. It's something that we have been doing together with the unions that we are approaching. Try to, of course, listen carefully. See if you can bring in a third party sometimes to make the dialogue go better if it is locked. And sometimes, I'm not speaking about your value chain now, but sometimes speaking to employers, producers, they said, well, our union is so bad, they're saying. But then sometimes it's a little bit a reflection also. So, so sometimes you actually get the unions to deserve. Not always, but it's like in a partnership. If you behave bad to your partner, you will get something back, right? So I think it's about creating a good relationship going on. No, I'm not. I have not started yet.
Maybe in the future.
But if I can just add, even though not speaking from the union perspective, but I think you were a bit too humble here. I think it's also what has been so key for us, and which I think would work in a similar situation, is that what Magnus and Unionen and IUF really has done an excellent job of doing is really trying to interpret everything that we are doing from our company side, and what does that mean within a union context, and what kind of common grounds do we see, and how can we find tool that works together, and vice versa, I would say, but often that dialogue with the unions, because we had very similar situations when we started the dialogue with the unions. They did not want to be in the same room as us, so by having IUF and Unionen on board and trying to simply explain what was happening, I think that helped to calm down the conversation. So just their presence helps.
And I think also realize that it takes time. It takes time
to build this relation and this credibility. First time we went to South Africa in this work, we got to speak with the workers, of course, and they said, do you know how many people who has been visiting us, looking into our reality, saying that they would reconnect with us, but never did? So many. So I think it's also so important to keep your promises, reconnect, and find ways of always doing. Like in a relationship, you must work on it for it to be good.
Continuous improvement. Linda.
Yes, thank you. I've got a quick question, also bringing it back to human rights and environmental due diligence and the expectation that you don't stop at your tier one. So you go down further, but we also know that you don't have a contractual relationship with those, the Systembolaget. How do you do that, say, in the current agreement that you have? How do you bring it below, say, tier one? And what are, say, the things that go well, and what are the challenges that you experience in doing that?
Great question, Linda. So I spoke about the importance of legality and having it in your general terms and conditions. So our contractual situation is that we only have business contracts with the Swedish importers, and then they have contracts with the producers, and they're in their turn with the sub-suppliers and farms. But what we have said in our general terms and conditions is that our code of conduct applies throughout the whole supply chain for a given product. So even though we technically don't have the business contract with them, the rules applies to everyone. So, and it's also formulated in a way that if you breach our contracts with regards to pricing, transports, packaging, or sustainability, it's all the same, which means that we could, if we wanted to, terminate. We have only done this once, so this is not a tool that we use, but the threat of that happening is the important thing. Because as soon as we use our leverage as a big buyer saying, look, if you don't do this that we have agreed, we could, then all of a sudden things happen, because money talks. Fact of the matter.
So the means of sales is scaring. To come back to a previous...
Scaring is efficient.
Please, Rachel. No? It's getting there.
This one? Okay. Rachel with Aldi South. Yeah, it was really, really interesting. And I would be curious to know, once we find something and we get into the process of trying to do something about it, to address it, to remediate, it's sort of like a whole new work stream and a whole new set of challenges to actually do something. And I think our experience has been fluctuation in the supply chain can then make that really challenging. So I was curious, in terms of buying model, the purchasing practices, did anything have to change in order to effectively remediate some of your findings?
You do realize that you're asking a monopoly this, right? I'll try to answer that quickly. So given that we are a monopoly, we're not allowed to say we are not sourcing from here or there. We need to have an open eye everywhere, which also means that we don't know from whom we're buying. So when we put out tenders, technically we can have a really severe case somewhere and they could win a tender and we don't know until afterwards, and then we would have to take action on that. But with that being said, if you're asking me if I think that it should, yes, because what we are seeing, we've been lucky in the cases that we've had so far, is that they have been related to producers and farms that we have long-going relationships with, and also importers or agents with long-going relationships with, and that helps. If we didn't have that, it would have been a lot more challenging. And we saw it actually to some extent, because the producer that was involved in one of the cases, they fell out of our big assortment. So we only had very, very small importers left. And we more or less had to do all the work ourselves because the importer is so small. So if you have the possibility to let these things affect your purchasing process to a much higher extent, I would definitely recommend it. We are looking at it, and we have made changes, but we are also restricted somewhat by the EU competition laws. So, but yes, strong yes.
Yes, one more question over there. Two more. You first, and then.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciated that we speak about a very specific project here, and yeah, we have heard or talked a lot about remediating on the ground, and I was wondering if any of the cases that you received, grievances that you received, have led to something to change in your own company, in your purchasing practices, in your way of doing your own business. So talking maybe about wages, do we have to change something within our company that has a negative impact on the supply chain, on the workers on the ground?
I would say absolutely, but probably in a bigger scheme of trying to work more in accordance with the UNGPs and trying to really take a hard look at ourselves, because it is, as you said, it's very easy to point at the supply chain and look at these producers and farm owners. Why are you not doing this, or how come you're doing X? But what are we doing to enable everyone to be, I don't even want to use compliant, but you know what I mean, to do a good job, right? So I would say yes, but then I would also say, so in the bigger scheme of things, but connected to this work, I think we've been getting actually a lot of feedback from the unions directly saying, I'll take a very concrete example. In the code, it is specifically said that the union should be involved in the auditing process, including remedial actions. So we never thought that we had to specifically say that in our general terms and conditions, because we thought it's in the code. But then the unions told us, look, we are very rarely involved in the auditing process. Can you ensure that we are involved? And we said, well, yeah, it is there, but we can make it clear. So we simply said, well, if for an auditor to take place, we need to have a signed paper from the union, if there is one, that they have been informed that there's an audit coming. And afterwards, we do not accept a remediation plan unless it has been signed by the union as well. So just a very, very small example of things that we could change based upon the feedback that we got from the unions, which we wouldn't have had if we didn't have this dialogue. So, and that's just one example. I could go on all day.
We have 1 more minute, so maybe one last question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Lisbeth Toto. I represent Colruyt Group. We are a Belgian retailer. And it was very interesting because we basically have the same questions, and we do try to also have local entities to help us, of course, to be closer to our entire supply chain. Yes, we have similar challenges. I was just wondering, is there any involvement also from the government side? Because, you know, human rights infringements can be really local, but it can also be systemic. And I guess that working with so many unions and so many production sites, you might see something, you know, recurring. And I can imagine it can be sometimes more effective to really work with the government. But of course, South Africa, I know a little bit. South Africa, it's not always easy. And then a second question, do you also share best practices? For instance, if you are able to have a successful remediation on one side, do you use actually that as an example to share maybe with other production sites that they can also learn from each other?
Okay, so the first question, the political level, it's very important, and it's one thing that also that we have discovered during this process working in South Africa, that it is a very important political leverage to be made also on the political level in South Africa. Wine, for example, is the third or fourth net value export product for South Africa. So it's a very important export product. Still, there is not enough, so to say, light put on this sector in agriculture compared to other sectors in South Africa, like industry, mining, and so on. So we need to get more political attention to the agricultural sector. And there is also a model for doing labor inspections through labor inspectors in South Africa. And that is also a work that is really needed to be even better, even more done. So we have actually pulled the strings on the Swedish government in relation with South African government to discuss these issues and try to push things forward.
And then I'll make an attempt to answer the second question. Yes, we do share best practices, both in relation to this, but I think in general, how we try to operate. But I think this work in particular has been important to showcase the good examples to, again, build trust with the Swedish importers and the South African producers so that they can see, for example, the two parties that were now involved in the Bitter Grapes documentary. If the two of them, I'm not going to name them, but you can go and look at the documentary, if the two of them can get along, if we could solve this within that group, we can probably use this tool elsewhere as well. So there's also a win-win in it for us to share because it builds trust with others for the process.
Okay, I think on this note we need to close. We're already running over. Sorry about this, but thank you so much. And I think this panel discussion really showed that engaging stakeholders in this context, workers' representatives can be a powerful tool complementing other tools such as amfori BSCI audits or the supply chain grievance mechanism. So thank you so much, both of you, and thank you to the audience for the great questions. And yeah, moving on.